Thanks for joining us. This is your host, Taylor Bradley, and you're listening to the TroopHR podcast. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Taylor Bradley, your host. Today, I'm joined by Helen Dayen. Helen is a Wall Street veteran turned executive coach with 2 decades of experience in high-stakes environments. Twice named top coach in New York, she coaches companies and ambitious leaders to reach maximum performance while navigating changes, interpersonal conflicts, and business challenges. Helen, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I am thrilled that you're here. We have an exciting topic today of going through the implications of working in a multi-generational workforce. For our listeners, I'd like to start at the ground floor. Could you give us an overview of the generations that are in the workforce today?
Yeah. So we obviously have so many different generations, starting with the baby boomers are not retiring yet. Some of them are still working. The economic environment has kept them working for longer than maybe they even want to. Also, some of them are feeling good and healthy, and so they're happy to stay on. And as other generations would say, keep the power and slow things down. And we'll get into that. And then we obviously have Gen Z, Gen X, millennials.
We'll break it up here into a couple different parts. You started out with the baby boomers, and I was recently speaking to an executive of the AARP, and she had highlighted that these individuals are staying in the workforce longer. Some of that may be due to economic circumstances, but they've also noticed in their data a higher return to workforce where people had retired perhaps in the pandemic, got a few years of retirement life and decided to enter in back in the workforce, which more the merrier. With the sub 4% unemployment rate, we need more talent entering the market. On the other end, you have the youngest generation that's now entering the workforce. What do you think are some of the key hallmarks of both ends of the paradigm right now?
One of the biggest things that people feel is the generations on the extremes have had a completely different work upbringing. So the oldest generations started out, they'll talk to you at length about starting out their career and a lot of paperwork, a lot of running things, not even to a printer or a copy machine, but to one of those stampy things for timestamps. It's a whole other of the technology evolution, right? And so then even between the baby boomer generation and I would say the millennials, right, that are now in their late 30s and early 40s, they have had an experience where they've seen the technology change their working experience quite a bit, but they've grown with it. They've had to learn as they were still nimble and young. Where the baby boomers started in their work, sometimes in some places without computers. And then you have the generations coming in now that literally came out of the womb holding an iPad or an iPhone. So they have never known life without technology that gave them immediate gratification, immediate access to the entire world. And so there are certain skills that make them really special in the workplace because they're so adaptable. They understand technology, but there are also ways that hold them back because they're not necessarily as self-reliant, if you will. I always tell my 11-year-old son, I say, you're seeing me driving the car and I've got navigation on, but you also need to know how to find your way and what are the different techniques of how to find your way when you don't have navigation, how to read a map, how to understand what different signs are, right?
There's even that enter the workforce where computers may not have been in the workplace yet. So it is interesting to see the technology shift on a practical level. If you were coaching some of our HR executives on putting together some type of training or awareness campaign of how to effectively work in a multi-generational workforce, what are 2 or 3 topics that come to mind?
Well, I think one is just that. It's the building the awareness of these different generations and what their work experience has been. The HR professionals that some of them are in those earlier generations, right? So they might not even necessarily have the awareness that you've got millennials or baby boomers or other generations that have had a different experience. Because they've had a different experience, their expectations are set in the way I did it was the right way when I was little, when I was younger. So there's a little bit of that frustration at the, let's call it senior levels or older generational levels. The expectation is this is how it should be done. Or, you should be able to go and figure it out. Or you should be sitting next to me side by side in an apprenticeship model and learning, which also, we didn't get to touch on this, is one of the really big differences between just about every generation versus the new generation that have entered the workforce past or during COVID, right? So anyone that started in the workplace in 2020 and then afterwards has had a very different experience in learning the work because they haven't, in many ways, haven't often been in person. There's a few, obviously, industries and places where people are physically together. R&D departments in pharma, in cosmetics, they're physically together in labs, right? So they have to be. Obviously, doctors. But if you're a lawyer, if you're in a tech company, if you're in a finance company, if you're in in marketing, and even in the pharma and consumer, if you're not in the R&D physically working with the chemicals, you maybe don't have to be in person. And so the way both earlier generations need to teach and train and connect has had to shift. And the younger generations are learning in a very different way.
The other aspects that I've encouraged folks is take advantage of seasoned knowledge, because a lot of the human capital issues that we're facing today are not original problems. Perhaps the tool to go about leveraging technology, things like that have changed.
Yeah.
But some of the best advice that I've ever been given has been by baby boomers or older generations. And that depth of knowledge, it matters, and it's worth its weight in gold. What other advice would you give to younger workers that are maybe entering the workforce or millennials, things of that?
The best advice I could give the younger generations is pick up the phone. And to them, it's very, very strange because they have been texting or slacking or Teams chats for a majority of their existence, is even how they communicate with their friends. So I would say, especially when you're dealing with an older generation, it can feel intimidating to just pick up the phone because you're worried, oh, this person is always in meetings, or maybe they don't want to talk to me. And obviously, you have to gain agreement. You have to understand the culture. So if you're in a culture where it's not typically a phone culture, then maybe you have to first discuss when you can pick up the phone and call or jump on a Zoom. But the more you can get off of the texting medium into a more video or phone medium, the better. I highly believe that. I think for any generation, but definitely for the younger generations. Take into account what the industry is. And I actually had this thought today. I was thinking of a particular individual I need to reach. And he sits on a trading floor, which means they're picking up and calling each other all day long. I know that because I used to sit on a trading floor 10 years ago. And it would be not surprising at all if I got a phone call in the middle of the day. So I was first going to send him an email and try to set up time. And then I realized that's not the culture over there. The culture over there is just to pick up the phone and call. So I did that. So that's a very specific tip I would say to anyone, is really think about that group to the extent that you have knowledge, or that industry or that company. What is the culture over there? Are they a Slack culture? And then you have to obviously make time, but I would move it into a different media.
Completely agree with that. We are at my company, so we're remote first and we're a Slack heavy culture. With my direct reports, I do use the phone a lot unless I'm talking to my direct reports that are in different countries. Yeah. But then I also use a great tool on Slack, Huddles, where it's just audio, right? People get a little zoomed out sometimes. So just having that walk and talk type atmosphere with individuals. I think it does boost creativity as well. Now, for organizations that are attempting to recruit in the next crop of young professionals that are now coming onto the marketplace, how do you encourage them to reach out to those individuals to create jobs and opportunities that resonate?
Younger generations are really focused on kind of social credibility. HR professionals need to think like marketing organizations now when they're thinking about hiring. They need to have the word on the street needs to be positive about the engagement and the working experience at the company. And there needs to be what we call social clout. So on Instagram, maybe on TikTok. I'm frankly not on TikTok, so I'm from the wrong generation to be talking about that. But on LinkedIn, I would say for professionals specifically, is you want to be able to show those next generations that you're engaging, that it's a positive experience. And I remember when I was graduating from NYU, the companies used to come in and they would show us these videos of these beautiful cultures that these banks, I was going to banks, had. And that is how we decided what the culture was and if it fit our culture based on these kind of marketing videos that they would make. And then, of course, talking to the fellow classmates that maybe graduated a few years ahead of us. Now it's very different. Now things are, first of all, much more immediate, much quicker. And so there needs to be a lot constantly on LinkedIn because the next generations are watching these companies. So I would say, be smart about being on social.
Be authentic, because this generation is so good at sniffing out BS. And so making sure that it's authentic, it can be a little gritty. It can be a little raw. It doesn't need to go through the brand marketing machine. That tends to not resonate. And utilize maybe some of your younger staff as well to share their journey and what they've been a part of, because you don't want to do that classic college brochure. Then when you show up on campus, it's nothing like the stock photos that they used, right?
Right. You said something earlier, which is important to note, which is take advice from the older generations. And I think when it comes to recruitment, in the older generations would actually meet with people that they were hiring. They would have lunch with them. They would have them out. They would connect with them. They would schmooze and dine. I don't know how much of that is happening. Again, with the virtual world, there's a lot more like interviews on Zoom. But I think going back to a little bit of the model of like more in person, it's also a benefit to the leadership of the company because we know how expensive it is to hire the wrong person and then to have to find a better person or a different person. It's really important to go back to the model where, yes, we want to be productive and it's, maybe more efficient online, but slow things down a little, have leadership take out those people. It's going to benefit both sides. Both sides are going to have a sense of, is this fit with our culture? Does this make sense? And I think what I see from my seat when I'm coaching leaders is they struggle to understand the generations coming in that they're not working with. If earlier on in the recruitment process, they're spending time with that in that one-on-one way, they're going to understand them a little bit more. And it's going to make it a little bit easier to figure out how to motivate them, how to engage them, which is what are the questions that leaders are coming to me with. They're saying, listen, I've got this standard. I've got these goals. This is how much money my department needs to make. And these kids coming out of college or have a completely different idea of what working hard looks like. And I'm frustrated. And how do I motivate them? And how do I engage them? And the assumption, and every generation before us thinks this about the next one. The assumption is they don't work as hard. They're silly. They're spoiled. It's like always. I actually had this in a room with 20 senior leaders at a financial service company. And they looked at me and they said, these new generations, they just don't want to work as hard as we do. And I was like, do any of you have mentors that are about 10 years, 15 years older than you? And all of them nodded their heads. I said, can you do me a favor and call them and ask them what they thought of you when you were first starting out? Because I bet they had the same feeling about you. And and it's true. Like if you think about it, every generation has that like, oh, kids these days, they're just not like us. we continue to see from history that new technologies are formed, new incredible things are happening. So I think it's just a little bit of a human existence of believing that, hey, we're better than the next generation. And what I challenge my leaders to do is to think about what they can learn from the new generation and how they can give them a voice, how they can share their expectations and be clear, but also how they can give them a voice.
I love that. The call out that adaptability is key, no matter what your position is or what generation you are. There's other things that you can learn from every generation that you're surrounded with. And if you have a culture that embraces that, you're going to have a competitive business culture.
Yeah.
It's going to marry the best of both worlds, which is a fantastic opportunity. Now, you have millennials starting to take on more senior management roles. And what have you seen is some of maybe their trademarks or traits for being in senior management?
Millennials are very interesting because they started their careers knowing a different world of like fewer technology, being a little bit more self-reliant on remembering things, writing things down, things like that. But they've grown with the technology, and most of them they get it up to a point. I'm like on the tail end of a millennial, and I would say the TikTok thing I don't get. But I'm on top of AI, which we can talk a little bit about if we have time. They're positioned quite nicely to be excellent leaders. They are starting to lose their way a little bit with this new generation because they think about things differently and they process the world differently. What they need to do is actually build their muscle of empathy and engagement. And again, I think a lot of them come to me and say, I just want them to work hard and do what I say, what I want. And so what I usually lean on is I help them remember what they were like. And the fact that the millennial generations, they got a lot of bad press and they all remember it. They all remember the bad press that they got, that they were the generation that was lazier and this and that, difficult to work with. And so I actually lean on having them remember that and think about how it felt because it's happening again to this generation. And that they can use that almost as a connection point and almost to bond over this. Hey, my generation used to be seen as these, whatever, inefficient, ineffective. And look at what
and part of that, I remember that. I remember those headlines. Anytime we start to create a caricature of a generation or anything like that in history, it never ends because these generations are not monolith, very diverse. I do encourage people when they take that myopic view, zoom out, because myopic views are not great in business. You mentioned you're on a trading floor. Being on a trading floor with a myopic view is a great way to lose money. So I would encourage people to be open-minded with that as well. And I love your point to reiterate to the listeners, draw it back, make it personal. You all remember those headlines? They were everywhere all the time of how bad of a generation we were, right? And there's always pros and cons with every generation, but you know what? That's life. And I really like how you patched it that every generation has faced this or felt similar things about prior generations. Now you brought up AI, which is always an interesting topic for me. I love learning about these things. And what's great is for all generations, this is a new technology to learn from scratch together. Zooming out a little bit, doesn't have to be directly related to the generational talk we're having here. What are some ways that you've leveraged AI or that you've seen AI leveraged in businesses and thought, oh, that's a really good idea?
I use AI in a very interesting way with my clients. So oftentimes my clients, again, a lot of the communication is in some text format, unless they're in meetings or huddles or something like that. And sometimes, quite often, tone is lost because everyone's rushing, has a million things to do. And so they'll write an email, and maybe to them, it's a totally neutral, normal email. And on the other side is somebody that works for them or with them or in a collaboration capacity. And they're reeling from that email, and ruminating on it for days because it offended them or hurt them or didn't take something into consideration. So the way I use AI is to encourage my clients to slow down enough to take that email, copy it into, assuming there's no confidential information, copy it into a chat GPT or something and say, I want to come across as friendly, powerful, decisive, empathetic, whatever the words are, rewrite the email with that. And then I use it for myself when I'm in a rush, right? When I know that I don't have time to sit there and make it more empathetic, I'll let AI help me. And it really helps with tone. You still want to sound like yourself. You talked about authenticity. So usually when I prompt for that, I say, still sound like me, but be more empathetic or something to that effect. And that prompt usually makes it effective. That's one that's been very, very effective. And then one of the things that I have seen is the quick access to information. And I say this with a lot of caution, which is that if a younger generation is working on something and they need help, they can ask a question to AI, to ChatGPT, and they can get a tremendous amount of information. I'm still cautious around using it, and sometimes it can be bland and not detailed enough for the work and for the industry they're in. So they can use it as a jumping off point, but then I would say go and connect with someone that is more experienced than you to understand it deeper. But you can get pretty good information pretty quickly as a starting off point if you're starting with no information.
I love both of those examples. The prompting is key. Not only can you prompt it to write in a particular way, but ways that HR folks can also leverage this, if there's not confidential information in there, is to say, hey, I'm going to send this email out about this new process. Act as an employee and provide me what you think the frequently asked questions will be. And it can be a pretty good sounding board to help gear how the email would be received. What are some of the FAQs? So really interesting prompts. I encourage folks to toy around with it. The other part is the hallucinations that you described, is these platforms can come across very authoritative in the way that they sound, and even cite things. They can make up sightings. So the guidance that I've given to my business partners that utilize this almost daily is that this should be a supplement to your voice, not a replacement. Anything that you're quoting from this, you should do your due diligence and go search in the web, find reputable resources to actually ensure that what you're saying is accurate.
Sorry. I was going to say, I will add, there's one more that has been really interesting, and it's talked about not as frequently, and it's using ChatGPT and AI to help think through difficult decisions. You say, I'm making this decision. This is how I'm thinking to approach it. Here's my conclusion. Act as a devil's advocate and ask me questions or challenge me so that I can really think through this. And that's really helpful, especially as a leader, to say, I'm making this decision. It's going to affect my team. Now act as a devil's advocate. And it forces you to consider all the different things that maybe you didn't consider when making a decision. And it can elevate decision-making, and it can elevate your leadership. And even if the decision you're making does impact someone in a negative way, now you're aware enough to take action and maybe go and talk to that person preemptively or something like that.
Another great use case. Listeners, really encourage you to go try that out. Now, to close this out here, I want to enter into the lightning round. First question that I have for you is that you've mentioned that you previously worked on a trading floor. And so I'm curious, your experience doing that, what was one takeaway that you took into your career in HR?
So I had my very first boss. He was an intense guy, really intimidating when you're first coming out of college, really scary. And he used to say to me over and over again, anticipate, anticipate, anticipate. And what he meant by that was be aware of what's going on and anticipate the need that a person is going to have. In this case, he was talking about his need. He wanted me to anticipate all his needs and completely get ahead of him so he would never have to ask me. But we were also in a client-facing role, so anticipate what the client is going to need to really be on the competitive edge. And I think that's such good advice, because then you can plan for what's coming.
I will love that. Anticipate, anticipate, anticipate. Next up, The question that I have for you is the 2024 TroopHR retreat in beautiful Florida. What was one takeaway that you had?
TroopHR is an amazing, warm community, and everyone's so willing to help each other. And it's one of the first times I've seen it in that way. So it was my first time going to the retreat. So I really just was really blown away by that. And then the other thing that I realized is that there's a lot of different experiences that HR professionals are having, depending on the type of the way the companies they're working for are set up and who the leadership is. What I mean by that is this a family-owned business? Is this a founder-led company? Is this now just a standard CEO that has been has replaced a founder? Or is it a public company with many layers? And the HR experience and the people experience is so different. And there is a real need for segmentation in those different types of leadership, because the leadership at the top actually affects the HR and people challenges.
It's a fantastic answer. And one of the reasons that I love TroopHR. So great call out. Another question for you. What advice would you give to someone on how to effectively work in a multi-generational workforce if you had to sum it up?
Listen and communicate. You might be the older one in the room, the more experienced one in the room, and you might feel the pressure to have all the answers, but you will get so much further and be so much more effective if you ask the right question and then listen, genuinely listen for the answer.
Absolutely love that. Final question to you. How can listeners get in touch with you?
Easiest way is LinkedIn. Look me up, Helen Dayen. I think there's only one of me. And my website is dayengroup.com.
Awesome. Helen, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
It was so much fun, Taylor. Great questions. You challenged me there quite a bit.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit TroopHR.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.